In the chaos of war, heroes emerge from the most unexpected places. Sometimes they wear combat boots and carry rifles. Sometimes they wear scrubs and carry stethoscopes. This is the story of Sarah Chun, a 28-year-old field medic whose gentle hands had saved countless lives, but whose fierce determination would soon save an entire hospital from destruction. When the enemy forces surrounded the remote field hospital in the mountains of Afghanistan, everyone expected the soldiers to defend it. No one expected the quiet medic who had never fired a weapon in combat to become the last line of defense between life and death for 67 wounded soldiers and medical staff. What happened over those 18 terrifying hours would challenge everything people thought they knew about courage, duty, and the true meaning of the oath to do no harm. Because sometimes, protecting life means being willing to take it. This is her story. This is how a medic became a warrior without ever abandoning her calling as a healer. Sarah Chun had always believed that hands were meant to heal, not to hurt. Growing up in a small town in Oregon, she watched her grandmother, a former nurse, tend to injured animals with the same care she gave to people. Sarah's grandmother would say that healing was not just about medicine, but about bringing hope to places where despair had taken root. When Sarah was 12, a terrible car accident happened just outside her house. She ran outside with her grandmother and watched as the older woman worked to save a young mother who had been thrown from her vehicle. Sarah held the woman's hand while her grandmother stopped the bleeding and kept her conscious until the ambulance arrived. The woman lived, and Sarah knew from that moment what her purpose in life would be. Medical school was challenging, but Sarah excelled. She specialized in emergency medicine and trauma care, driven by memories of that day when she was 12. Her professors noted her unusual calm under pressure and her ability to make quick, life-saving decisions. But it was her compassion that set her apart. Sarah treated every patient as if they were her own family member. After graduating, Sarah could have taken a comfortable position at any major hospital. Instead, she chose to join the Army Medical Corps. Her friends thought she was crazy. Her parents worried constantly. But Sarah felt called to serve where the need was greatest. She wanted to be there for soldiers who were far from home, frightened, and in pain. Her first deployment took her to a forward operating base in Afghanistan. The base hospital treated both American soldiers and local civilians caught in the crossfire of war. Sarah quickly earned the respect of everyone there, from the commanding officers to the local Afghan staff, who helped with translation and basic care. The work was intense and emotionally draining. Sarah would spend 12-hour shifts treating gunshot wounds, shrapnel injuries, and the devastating effects of improvised explosive devices. She learned to work with limited supplies and equipment, making do with whatever was available. Every day brought new challenges, new tragedies, and small victories when lives were saved. One particular case stayed with Sarah throughout her deployment. A young Afghan boy, maybe 8 years old, was brought in after stepping on a landmine. His leg was severely damaged, and he was terrified, crying for his mother who had been killed in the same explosion. Sarah spent 3 days and nights by his bedside, learning basic phrases in his language to comfort him. She sang him songs her grandmother had sung to her, even though he couldn't understand the words. The melody seemed to calm him. The boy survived and eventually was able to walk again with the help of a prosthetic leg. Before he left the hospital, he drew Sarah a picture of 2 people holding hands under a bright sun. She kept that picture in her pocket throughout the rest of her deployment. Sarah's reputation as both a skilled medic and a compassionate caregiver spread beyond her own base. She was often called to assist at other locations when they faced particularly difficult cases. Her commanding officer, Colonel Martinez, frequently praised her work and recommended her for commendations. But Sarah wasn't interested in recognition. She just wanted to help people heal. During her second deployment, Sarah was assigned to a smaller, more remote field hospital in the mountains. The facility was about 2 hours by helicopter from the nearest major base. It served as a crucial medical station for patrols operating in the difficult mountain terrain. The hospital was staffed by only 12 medical personnel, including Sarah, and protected by a small security detail of 15 soldiers. The mountain hospital was different from the larger base where Sarah had worked before. Resources were more limited, and they often had to be creative in their treatment methods. But Sarah thrived in this environment. She developed close relationships with both the medical staff and the security team. Everyone knew they depended on each other for survival. Dr. James Morrison, the chief medical officer, was a veteran Army surgeon who had served multiple tours. He became a mentor to Sarah, teaching her advanced surgical techniques that weren't normally part of a medic's training. He believed that in remote locations like theirs, every medical person needed to be prepared to handle any emergency. Sarah also grew close to the other medics and nurses. There was Janet Williams, a tough nurse from Texas who had been in the Army for 15 years. Miguel Santos, a young medic from California who was on his first deployment. And Dr. Lisa Park, a psychiatrist who helped soldiers deal with the mental trauma of war. They became like family to Sarah, supporting each other through the hardest days. The local population in the mountain region was different too. Many of the Afghan civilians they treated had never seen modern medical care before. Sarah spent her free time learning about local customs and traditional healing practices. She found ways to combine modern medicine with respect for local beliefs, which helped patients feel more comfortable and trust the medical team. One elderly Afghan man named Rashid began bringing his sick grandchildren to the hospital regularly. He initially was suspicious of the American medical team, especially the women doctors and medics. But Sarah's gentle approach and obvious care for his family gradually won him over. He started bringing gifts of tea and local bread, and even began helping other local families overcome their fears of seeking medical treatment. Sarah's days at the mountain hospital followed a routine. She would wake before dawn to check on overnight patients. Mornings were usually busy with soldiers coming in from patrols with minor injuries, altitude sickness, or routine medical needs. Afternoons often brought more serious cases, combat injuries, accident victims, or critically ill local civilians. Evenings were Sarah's favorite time. After the urgent work was done, she would sit with patients who were recovering, reading to them, or just talking about home. Many soldiers were young, barely out of high school, and they missed their families terribly. Sarah became like a big sister to many of them, listening to their fears and helping them process the difficult things they had seen. The mountain hospital had a small library, mostly donated books from home. Sarah organized reading groups for recovering patients and off-duty staff. She also started a letter-writing program, helping soldiers who struggled with writing stay in touch with their families. Her grandmother had taught her that healing involved not just the body, but the mind and spirit as well. Security at the mountain hospital was relatively light. The remote location and difficult terrain made it seem unlikely that enemy forces would attempt a direct attack. The security team, led by Sergeant First Class David Kumar, maintained defensive positions but hadn't faced serious threats during Sarah's time there. Sergeant Kumar was an experienced soldier who had served tours in Iraq and Afghanistan. He took his responsibility for protecting the medical facility seriously, but he also understood that their mission was primarily humanitarian. He often worked with Sarah and the medical team to coordinate care for local civilians, making sure security procedures didn't interfere with medical treatment. The relationship between the medical staff and security team was excellent. Unlike some facilities where there was tension between different units, everyone at the mountain hospital understood they were part of one team with one mission: saving lives and helping people. Sarah had been at the mountain hospital for 6 months when things began to change in the region. Intelligence reports indicated increased enemy activity in the surrounding mountains. Patrols began reporting more frequent contact with hostile forces. The number of combat casualties brought to the hospital increased steadily. Despite the growing danger, Sarah felt more committed than ever to her work. The increase in wounded soldiers meant her skills were needed more than ever. She began working longer hours, often staying up all night to care for critical patients. Dr. Morrison was concerned about her exhaustion, but Sarah insisted she was fine. One night, while treating a soldier who had been shot in the chest, Sarah realized how much she had changed since her first deployment. The terrified young woman who had arrived in Afghanistan 2 years earlier had become a confident, skilled medical professional. She could now perform emergency procedures that once would have terrified her. She had learned to stay calm, even in the most chaotic situations. But, more importantly, Sarah had learned that being a healer sometimes meant being strong in ways she had never imagined. It meant staying awake for 36 hours straight to save a life. It meant being the last friendly face a dying soldier saw and making sure he wasn't alone. It meant finding hope in the darkest situations and sharing that hope with others. The first signs of trouble came on a Tuesday morning in late October. Sarah was checking on overnight patients when she heard the distinctive sound of helicopters approaching the hospital landing pad. This wasn't unusual. Medical evacuations and supply deliveries happened regularly. But something felt different this time. The helicopters sounded like they were in a hurry. Sergeant Kumar rushed into the medical building, his face tense with worry. He found Dr. Morrison and spoke in low, urgent tones. Sarah couldn't hear what they were saying, but she saw Dr. Morrison's expression change from concern to alarm. Within minutes, the entire medical staff was called to an emergency briefing. The news was sobering. A large American patrol had been ambushed about 20 miles to the east. Multiple casualties were incoming, including several soldiers with critical injuries. But that wasn't the worst part. Intelligence indicated that the ambush was part of a larger enemy operation in the region. Enemy forces were moving through the mountains in numbers not seen before. Dr. Morrison explained that they needed to prepare for a surge of patients while also being ready for possible evacuation if the security situation deteriorated further. Sarah felt her stomach tighten with worry, but her training kicked in immediately. She began mentally preparing the treatment areas for multiple trauma cases. The first helicopter arrived within 30 minutes, carrying 6 wounded soldiers. Sarah's team worked quickly to triage the patients, determining who needed immediate surgery and who could wait. The most serious case was a young private who had taken shrapnel to his abdomen and was losing blood rapidly. Sarah assisted Dr. Morrison in emergency surgery while other medical staff treated the remaining patients. The young private was barely 18 years old, and he kept asking for his mother as they worked to save his life. Sarah held his hand whenever she could spare a moment, reassuring him that he was going to be okay. Over the next 6 hours, 3 more helicopter loads of casualties arrived. The small hospital was pushed to its absolute limits. Every bed was occupied, and some patients had to be treated on stretchers in the hallways. Sarah worked without stopping, moving from patient to patient, doing everything she could to stabilize the wounded. By evening, the immediate crisis had passed. Most of the wounded soldiers were stable, though several would need to be evacuated to larger medical facilities for additional surgery. Sarah was exhausted, but she felt proud of how the team had performed under pressure. They had saved lives that might have been lost at a less capable facility. Dr. Morrison gathered the medical staff for a brief meeting. He praised their work during the crisis, but also shared troubling news. Intelligence reports indicated that enemy forces were consolidating in the mountains around their position. The ambush earlier that day appeared to be just the beginning of a larger offensive. More concerning was the news that several other remote bases in the region had come under attack. One small outpost had been completely overrun, with all personnel either killed or captured. Another base had successfully repelled an attack, but suffered heavy casualties in the process. Sergeant Kumar joined the meeting to explain the security implications. He had been in contact with his superiors and with other bases in the region. The consensus was that the mountain hospital was likely to become a target. Its strategic location and symbolic value made it an attractive objective for enemy forces. The evacuation plan was simple but problematic. If ordered to evacuate, they would have to be ready to leave within 2 hours. All critically wounded patients would be loaded onto helicopters and flown to safer facilities. The medical equipment that couldn't be quickly moved would be destroyed to prevent it from falling into enemy hands. Sarah raised the obvious problem with this plan. Several of their current patients were too unstable to survive helicopter transport. Moving them could kill them just as surely as leaving them behind. Dr. Morrison acknowledged this dilemma, but explained that they might not have a choice. If enemy forces attacked in strength, staying could mean death for everyone. The meeting ended with instructions for everyone to prepare personal evacuation bags and to be ready to implement the evacuation plan at a moment's notice. Medical equipment was prioritized for removal, with the most critical items marked for immediate loading if evacuation became necessary. That night, Sarah couldn't sleep. She walked through the hospital, checking on patients and thinking about the impossible choice they might face. In the bed nearest the window was the young private from that morning's surgery. His name was Tommy Rodriguez, and he was from a small town in Arizona. He had joined the army to earn money for college and to serve his country. Tommy was stable but still very weak. Moving him would be extremely dangerous, possibly fatal. Sarah sat beside his bed for a while, watching him sleep and thinking about his family back home. They probably had no idea their son was lying wounded in a remote hospital that might soon come under attack. In another bed was an Afghan civilian, an elderly farmer who had been injured when his tractor hit a landmine. His name was Abdul, and he reminded Sarah of her own grandfather. He had been brought to the hospital by his sons, who had then disappeared back into the mountains. Abdul didn't speak English, but he would smile and nod whenever Sarah checked on him. Moving Abdul would also be very dangerous. But, unlike the American soldiers, he had no chance of being evacuated to a major medical facility. If the hospital was abandoned, he would be left behind with no medical care at all. The thought of leaving vulnerable patients to face whatever came next made Sarah feel sick. Sarah made rounds through all the wards, mentally noting which patients could be moved and which ones could not. She realized that if evacuation became necessary, they would have to make terrible decisions about who to take and who to leave behind. These weren't just medical decisions. They were moral decisions about the value of human life. The next morning brought more bad news. Overnight, enemy forces had attacked another remote base just 40 miles away. The attack had been repelled, but intelligence indicated that the enemy was using it as a probing action to test American defenses and response times. More attacks were expected. Dr. Morrison called another meeting and announced that they had been placed on evacuation alert status. This meant they could receive orders to evacuate at any time and would have to be ready to implement the plan within 1 hour of receiving the order. Everyone was told to keep their evacuation bags with them at all times. Sarah spent the morning reorganizing medical supplies according to the evacuation priority list. The most essential equipment, portable monitors, emergency surgical kits, and critical medications, was staged near the helicopter landing area. Less critical supplies were moved to secondary staging areas. The work was emotionally difficult for Sarah. She was essentially preparing to abandon the place where she had done some of her best work as a medic. The mountain hospital had become home to her, and the patients there had become her responsibility. Preparing to leave felt like planning to betray everything she believed about medical care. Around noon, Sergeant Kumar approached Sarah with an unusual request. He had been thinking about the evacuation plan and had identified a problem. If they came under attack while trying to evacuate, they would need every available person to help move patients and equipment. But they would also need people who could defend the hospital if the security team became overwhelmed. Kumar had reviewed the personnel files and discovered that Sarah had qualified as expert marksman during her basic training. Unlike most medics, she had also completed advanced combat training before her first deployment. Kumar wanted to know if Sarah would be willing to help with defense if evacuation became impossible. The request caught Sarah completely off guard. She had never considered the possibility of having to fight while serving as a medic. Her entire identity was built around healing, not hurting. The idea of using a weapon against another person went against everything she believed about her role and her purpose. But Kumar's logic was hard to argue against. If they came under attack and couldn't evacuate their patients, someone would have to defend them. The security team was small and might not be enough if enemy forces attacked in large numbers. Everyone who could help might make the difference between life and death for the patients they were sworn to protect. Sarah asked for time to think about it. Kumar understood her hesitation and told her that he wouldn't pressure her to make a decision. But he also reminded her that their primary mission was to protect the patients under their care, and sometimes that might require difficult choices. That afternoon, Sarah found herself thinking about her grandmother's stories from World War II. Her grandmother had served as a nurse in field hospitals in Europe, treating wounded soldiers from both sides of the conflict. She had always told Sarah that the most important thing was to preserve life, regardless of the circumstances. But Sarah's grandmother had also told her stories about times when the hospitals came under attack. She had described hiding in basements with wounded soldiers while battles raged overhead. She had talked about the courage required not just to heal, but to protect those who couldn't protect themselves. As Sarah thought about these stories, she began to understand that her grandmother's concept of healing was more complex than she had realized. It wasn't just about treating injuries and illness. It was about creating and protecting spaces where healing could happen. Sometimes that meant standing between wounded people and those who would harm them. Evening brought more disturbing intelligence reports. Enemy forces in the region were estimated to be much larger than initially thought. Some reports suggested that several hundred fighters had moved into the mountains around the hospital's location. More concerning was evidence that they had heavy weapons and were planning coordinated attacks on multiple American positions. The final straw came when radio contact was lost with 2 American patrols that had been operating in the mountains to the north of the hospital. Search helicopters had been unable to locate any signs of the missing soldiers. It was becoming clear that enemy forces had effective control of large areas around the mountain hospital. Dr. Morrison called the medical staff together one more time. He explained that evacuation orders were expected within the next 12 to 24 hours. When those orders came, they would have very little time to execute the plan. Everyone needed to be mentally prepared for what was coming. Sarah raised her hand and asked the question everyone had been thinking. What about the patients who couldn't be safely moved? Dr. Morrison's answer was honest, but painful. They would have to make difficult decisions based on medical triage principles. Patients with the best chance of survival would be prioritized for evacuation. Those who were too critically injured to move would have to be left behind with whatever medical supplies could be spared. The meeting ended in somber silence. Everyone understood what this meant. They were preparing to abandon patients who needed their care, possibly condemning them to death. It went against every principle of medical ethics they had sworn to uphold. But the alternative might be the death of everyone at the hospital. After the meeting, Sarah walked outside to clear her head. The mountain air was crisp and clean, and the view across the valley was spectacular. It was hard to believe that such a beautiful place could become a battlefield. She thought about all the patients they had treated in this location, all the lives that had been saved. Sergeant Kumar found Sarah standing outside the medical building, looking up at the stars. He didn't say anything at first, just stood beside her in comfortable silence. Finally, he asked if she had thought about his earlier request. Sarah told him about her grandmother and the stories from World War II. She explained her internal conflict between her identity as a healer and the possibility of having to use violence. Kumar listened without judgment, understanding the difficulty of her position. Finally, Sarah asked Kumar a direct question. If enemy forces attacked and they couldn't evacuate the patients, what would happen to the wounded soldiers and civilians who couldn't defend themselves? Kumar's answer was blunt. Without adequate defense, everyone in the hospital would likely be killed or captured. The attack came at dawn on a Thursday, just as Sarah was finishing her night shift rounds. She had been checking on Tommy Rodriguez, the young private who was slowly recovering from his abdominal surgery, when the first explosions shook the building. The sound was unlike anything she had experienced before, a deep, thunderous boom that seemed to come from all directions at once. Sarah's first instinct was to protect her patients. She immediately dropped to the floor and crawled to Tommy's bedside, covering his body with her own as pieces of plaster fell from the ceiling. Around the ward, other patients who were able began moving toward whatever cover they could find. Those who couldn't move looked at Sarah with fear and confusion, not understanding what was happening. The hospital's alarm system began blaring, and Sarah could hear Sergeant Kumar's voice over the intercom system, shouting instructions for all personnel to implement emergency defensive positions. The words Sarah had hoped never to hear were being broadcast throughout the facility. The hospital is under attack. This is not a drill. Dr. Morrison appeared in the doorway of the medical ward, his face grim but determined. He quickly surveyed the patients and began giving rapid-fire instructions to Sarah and the other medical staff who had gathered. The most critically injured patients needed to be moved away from windows and exterior walls. Those who could walk needed to help those who couldn't. As Sarah helped move patients to safer positions within the building, she could hear the sound of gunfire erupting outside. It started with scattered shots, but quickly escalated to what sounded like a full-scale battle. She recognized the distinctive sound of American M4 rifles mixed with the different pitch of AK-47s used by enemy forces. The initial mortar attack had targeted the hospital's communication equipment and helicopter landing pad. Sarah realized this was a strategic move designed to prevent evacuation and cut off outside assistance. The enemy had clearly planned this attack carefully, knowing exactly what targets would trap everyone inside the facility. Miguel Santos, the young medic who had become like a little brother to Sarah, appeared at her side carrying additional medical supplies. His face was pale with fear, but he was functioning professionally despite the chaos around them. Sarah grabbed his shoulder and looked directly into his eyes, speaking in the calm, authoritative voice she had developed through months of emergency situations. "Miguel, I need you to focus on me, okay? We're going to get through this, but I need you to stay calm and do exactly what we've trained for." Miguel nodded, and Sarah could see him drawing strength from her confidence. She had learned that in crisis situations, someone had to project calm and control, even when they didn't feel it internally. The sound of gunfire was getting closer to the building. Through the windows, Sarah could see muzzle flashes in the early morning darkness and figures moving between the external buildings of the hospital compound. Sergeant Kumar's voice came over the radio again, reporting that enemy forces had breached the outer perimeter and were advancing toward the main medical facility. Dr. Morrison made the decision that everyone had been dreading. With the landing pad destroyed and enemy forces surrounding the hospital, evacuation was no longer possible. They were trapped with 67 patients and staff members, and they would have to defend their position until help could arrive. The question was whether help would come in time. Sarah felt a strange sense of clarity as Dr. Morrison announced their situation. All the uncertainty and worry of the past few days was gone, replaced by the immediate reality of what they faced. There was no more time for doubt or internal debate. The patients in this building needed protection, and she was one of the people responsible for providing it. Sergeant Kumar entered the medical building with 3 of his soldiers. They were establishing defensive positions inside the facility while the rest of the security team tried to hold the outer perimeter. Kumar looked around the room and made eye contact with Sarah, silently asking if she remembered their conversation about helping with defense. Sarah nodded and followed Kumar to a storage closet where additional weapons were kept. He handed her an M4 rifle and extra ammunition, quickly reviewing the weapons operation and safety procedures. Sarah's hands remembered the training from years before, automatically checking the weapon and preparing it for use. "The main thing is to stay calm and make your shots count," Kumar told her. "These guys are good, but they don't expect resistance from medical personnel. That might give us an advantage." He explained that enemy forces typically try to take hospitals intact to use the medical supplies and equipment. This meant they might not use heavy weapons that could destroy the building. Kumar positioned Sarah at a window that provided a good view of the main approach to the medical building. Her job was to watch for enemy movement and provide covering fire for the security team when needed. Most importantly, she was the last line of defense if enemy forces managed to breach the building itself. As Sarah took her position at the window, she could see the full scope of the attack developing outside. Enemy fighters were advancing methodically through the hospital compound, using buildings and equipment for cover. They appeared to be well-trained and disciplined, not the disorganized fighters American forces sometimes encountered. The first enemy fighter Sarah saw clearly was a man in his 30s wearing local civilian clothing, but carrying military-grade weapons. He was moving carefully from building to building, obviously trying to flank the American defensive positions. Sarah watched him through her rifle scope, knowing she might have to shoot him, but hoping she wouldn't. The sound of gunfire from outside intensified, and Sarah could hear Kumar's voice on the radio coordinating with his soldiers. The security team was doing their best to hold defensive positions, but they were outnumbered and outgunned. Several soldiers had already been wounded, and ammunition was becoming a concern. Inside the medical building, Dr. Morrison and the nursing staff were doing their best to keep patients calm while also preparing to treat wounded defenders. Janet Williams had set up an emergency surgical station in the most protected part of the building. Lisa Park, the psychiatrist, was moving between patients, using her training to help them cope with the terror of being in a combat zone. Sarah's grandmother had told her stories about field hospitals under attack during World War II, but hearing about it was nothing like experiencing it. The noise was overwhelming: gunfire, explosions, shouting voices, and the sound of fear from patients who didn't understand what was happening to them. The smell of gunpowder and smoke drifted through the broken windows. The first time Sarah had to fire her weapon came when she saw two enemy fighters attempting to approach the medical building from her side. They were using a damaged ambulance for cover, moving in short rushes toward the building's entrance. Sarah knew that if they reached the building, they would be inside with the patients within minutes. Sarah aimed carefully, remembering her training about breathing and trigger control. The enemy fighters were about 50 meters away, close enough that she couldn't miss if she aimed properly. She fired 2 shots at the first fighter, seeing him fall immediately. The second fighter dove for cover, but Sarah could see his position behind the ambulance. The reality of what she had just done hit Sarah like a physical blow. She had shot another human being, possibly killed him. Her hands began shaking, and she felt nauseous. But then, she heard Tommy Rodriguez calling out in fear from his bed across the room, and she remembered why she was there. These people were trying to hurt her patients. Kumar's voice came over the radio with an urgent update. The outer defensive perimeter was collapsing. Several soldiers had been wounded, and ammunition was running low. Enemy forces were preparing for a final assault on the medical building itself. Everyone inside needed to be ready for close-quarters combat. Dr. Morrison gathered all the medical staff who weren't directly treating patients. He explained that they were about to face the worst-case scenario they had all hoped to avoid. Enemy forces would likely breach the building within the next few minutes. Everyone who could fight needed to be ready to defend their patients. Sarah looked around the room at her colleagues and realized they were all looking to her for leadership. She had become the bridge between the medical staff and the security team, the person who could function in both worlds. Miguel Santos was standing beside her, holding a pistol with shaking hands. Janet Williams had a rifle, but looked uncertain about how to use it. "Listen to me, everyone," Sarah said, using the authoritative voice that had helped her lead medical teams through crisis situations. "Our patients are depending on us. We're going to protect them, and we're going to get through this. Stay calm, follow your training, and remember why we're here." The sound of gunfire was now very close to the building. Sarah could hear Kumar's soldiers fighting desperately to delay the enemy advance, but they were running out of time. Through her window, she could see enemy fighters gathering for what looked like a coordinated assault on multiple sides of the building. Sarah made a decision that would have seemed impossible just days before. She told Miguel to take her position at the window and move toward the main entrance of the building. If enemy forces were going to breach multiple entry points simultaneously, someone needed to coordinate the defense of the most likely entry point. At the main entrance, Sarah found Sergeant Kumar and 2 wounded soldiers preparing to make their final stand. Kumar looked at her with surprise and gratitude, understanding that she had chosen to leave the relative safety of her position to join the most dangerous part of the defense. "How many are out there?" Sarah asked Kumar, checking her ammunition and preparing for close combat. Kumar estimated at least 30 enemy fighters were positioned around the building, with more possibly approaching. The odds were overwhelming, but surrender wasn't an option when patients' lives were at stake. The final assault began with a coordinated attack on 3 sides of the building. Enemy fighters used explosive charges to breach the main entrance while others attempted to enter through windows and a side door. Sarah found herself in the middle of the most intense combat of her life, fighting not as a soldier, but as a protector of the helpless. The first enemy fighter through the main entrance was met by concentrated fire from Kumar, Sarah, and the 2 wounded soldiers. The fighter fell immediately, but others quickly followed. Sarah's training took over, and she moved and fired with precision she didn't know she possessed. Her focus was absolute: protect the patients, stop the attackers. In the chaos of close-quarters battle inside the medical building, Sarah lost track of time and individual actions. She moved from position to position, firing when she had clear shots and helping evacuate patients when possible. The sound of gunfire inside the building was deafening, and the smell of gunpowder mixed with the antiseptic odors of the hospital. At one point, Sarah found herself face-to-face with an enemy fighter who had broken through the defensive line. He was young, probably not much older than some of the patients she had treated. For a split second, they looked at each other with mutual recognition of their shared humanity. Then, Sarah remembered Tommy Rodriguez lying helpless in his hospital bed, and she fired. The battle inside the building lasted about 20 minutes, though it felt like hours to Sarah. When the gunfire finally stopped, she realized that they had successfully repelled the assault. Enemy fighters who weren't killed or wounded had withdrawn to regroup. But Sarah knew this was just the beginning. They would be back. Kumar was wounded, but still functional. Of the original security team, only he and one other soldier were still able to fight effectively. Among the medical staff, Sarah had emerged as the most capable fighter, something that would have shocked everyone who knew her just a week before. As they checked on patients and treated the wounded, Sarah realized after the first assault was repelled, an eerie quiet settled over the mountain hospital. Sarah moved through the damaged building, checking on patients and assessing their defensive capabilities. The reality of their situation was becoming clear. They were completely cut off from outside help, surrounded by enemy forces, and running low on ammunition and medical supplies. Tommy Rodriguez, the young private Sarah had been treating, grabbed her hand as she checked his wounds. "Doc, are we going to die here?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Sarah looked into his frightened eyes and made a promise she wasn't sure she could keep. "Not if I have anything to say about it," she told him. "We're going to get you home." Sergeant Kumar called a meeting of all personnel who could still fight effectively. In addition to himself, there were 2 wounded but functional soldiers, Sarah and, surprisingly, Miguel Santos, who had shown unexpected courage during the first assault. Dr. Morrison and Janet Williams could also handle weapons if necessary, giving them a total of 7 people to defend a building housing 67 patients and staff. The tactical situation was grim. Enemy forces controlled all approaches to the hospital and had demonstrated they were willing to engage in sustained combat. Radio communications were completely cut off, meaning no one outside the immediate area knew they were under attack. Helicopter evacuation was impossible, with enemy fighters controlling the surrounding high ground. Kumar spread a hand-drawn map of the hospital compound on a table and began explaining their defensive strategy. They would have to assume that enemy forces would launch multiple assaults over the coming hours or days. Each assault would likely be larger and better coordinated than the last. Their only advantages were defensive positions inside the building and the enemy's apparent desire to capture medical supplies intact. Sarah studied the map and realized something that Kumar had also recognized. The medical building was actually well situated for defense. It was constructed of concrete and steel, with limited entry points and good fields of fire from the windows. More importantly, it contained everything they needed for an extended siege: medical supplies, food, water, and space for all the patients. The next several hours passed in tense preparation. Sarah and Miguel worked together to move patients away from windows and exterior walls, creating a more secure treatment area in the center of the building. Dr. Morrison and Janet Williams prepared emergency medical stations in protected locations, anticipating more wounded defenders. As evening approached, Sarah found herself thinking about the irony of their situation. She had come to Afghanistan to save lives, and now she was preparing to take them. But as she looked around the makeshift fortress they had created, she realized that everything she was doing was still ultimately about preserving life. The patients in this building couldn't protect themselves, so she would do it for them. The second assault came at sunset. This time, enemy forces approached more cautiously, having learned from their initial failures. They used covering fire from multiple positions to pin down the defenders while assault teams advanced on the building. Sarah found herself in prolonged firefights with enemies she couldn't always see clearly. During this assault, Sarah discovered something about herself that she had never known. Under extreme stress, in life-or-death situations, she became incredibly calm and focused. While other defenders were sometimes panicked or confused, Sarah found herself thinking clearly and making good tactical decisions. Kumar noticed this too and began relying on her judgment about defensive positioning. The second assault lasted longer than the first, nearly an hour of intermittent fighting. Enemy forces managed to get closer to the building, but were again repelled without breaching the interior. However, the cost was higher this time. One of Kumar's remaining soldiers was seriously wounded, and their ammunition supplies were significantly depleted. After the second assault, Sarah realized they needed to think beyond just repelling attacks. They needed to find ways to reduce the enemy's effectiveness and conserve their own resources. She suggested using medical knowledge to their advantage, creating improvised smoke grenades from cleaning chemicals, and using medical equipment to enhance their defensive capabilities. Dr. Morrison proved surprisingly resourceful in helping develop these unconventional tactics. His surgical precision was useful in creating improvised explosive devices from medical supplies and cleaning chemicals. Janet Williams used her knowledge of pharmaceuticals to create incapacitating agents that could be deployed if enemy forces breached the building. As night fell, Sarah established a watch rotation that would allow some defenders to rest while others maintained security. She took the first watch herself, positioning herself where she could observe the main approaches to the building. In the darkness, she could see enemy campfires in the surrounding area and occasionally glimpse movement that suggested they were planning another assault. During the quiet hours of her watch, Sarah thought about her family back home. Her parents had no idea their daughter was fighting for her life in a remote mountain hospital. She wondered if she would ever see them again, and whether they would understand the choices she had made. She hoped they would be proud of how she had tried to protect her patients. Tommy Rodriguez was awake and in pain, so Sarah sat with him for a while during her watch. He told her about his girlfriend back home, about his plans to study engineering after his military service, about his dreams for the future. Sarah listened and encouraged him, knowing that hope was often as important as medical treatment in helping patients survive. Around midnight, Miguel Santos joined Sarah for his watch shift. The young medic had changed dramatically since the fighting began. The scared boy who had been afraid to carry a weapon had become a steady, reliable fighter who could be counted on in crisis situations. Sarah felt proud of his transformation and grateful for his support. "I never thought I could do this," Miguel told her as they shared watch duties. "I never thought I could hurt anyone." Sarah understood his feelings completely. "We're not hurting people," she replied. "We're protecting people. There's a difference, even if it doesn't feel like it right now." The third assault came before dawn, while Sarah was catching a brief rest. She was awakened by the sound of gunfire and explosions, immediately grabbing her weapon and moving to her assigned position. This assault was different from the previous two. Enemy forces had brought heavier weapons and were using more sophisticated tactics. Mortar rounds began falling around the hospital building, shaking the structure and causing panic among the patients. Sarah realized that enemy forces had decided to accept some damage to the building in order to break the defenders' resistance. The rules of engagement had changed, and their situation had become even more desperate. During the third assault, Sarah had to make decisions she never could have imagined. When enemy forces used explosive charges to breach a wall and began entering the building, she found herself in hand-to-hand combat with fighters who had gotten past the outer defenses. Her medical training helped her understand human anatomy in ways that made her surprisingly effective in close combat. The fighting inside the building was chaotic and terrifying. Sarah moved from room to room, sometimes fighting alongside Kumar and sometimes alone, trying to prevent enemy forces from reaching the patients. At one point, she found herself protecting the bed where Abdul, the elderly Afghan farmer, was recovering from his landmine injuries. The irony wasn't lost on her that she was fighting Afghan fighters to protect an Afghan civilian. When the third assault was finally repelled, Sarah realized that their defensive situation had fundamentally changed. Enemy forces were now willing to damage the hospital to achieve their objectives, which meant patients were at much greater risk. More importantly, the defenders had suffered additional casualties and were nearly out of ammunition. Kumar called another strategic meeting, this time including all the medical staff in the planning discussion. Their ammunition would last through maybe one more major assault. After that, they would be reduced to fighting with whatever improvised weapons they could create. The situation was becoming hopeless from a military perspective. Dr. Morrison suggested something that shocked everyone. Maybe it was time to consider surrender, with the hope that enemy forces would respect medical neutrality and allow the treatment of patients to continue. Kumar rejected this immediately, explaining that intelligence reports indicated enemy forces in this region did not respect medical neutrality and often executed prisoners. Sarah listened to the debate, but found herself thinking about a different option. Instead of just defending reactively, waiting for the next assault, maybe they should take the initiative. The enemy forces outside were confident and probably not expecting any aggressive action from medical personnel. A surprise counterattack might disrupt their plans and buy time for rescue. The idea was militarily sound but ethically complex for medical personnel. Sarah was essentially suggesting that doctors and medics launch an offensive military operation. Kumar was intrigued by the tactical possibilities, but concerned about asking medical staff to take such risks. Sarah made her argument based on medical ethics rather than military strategy. Their primary obligation was to their patients, and passive defense was no longer adequate to protect them. If aggressive action was necessary to preserve life, then it was not only acceptable but required. She convinced the group to consider a limited counterattack designed to disrupt enemy preparations. The plan they developed was simple but dangerous. Sarah, Kumar, and Miguel would attempt to infiltrate enemy positions under cover of darkness and destroy their heavy weapons. Without mortars and other heavy weapons, enemy forces would be limited to small arms attacks that the hospital building could better withstand. Dr. Morrison initially opposed the plan, arguing that it was too dangerous and went beyond what should be expected of medical personnel. But when Sarah pointed out that the alternative was watching their patients die in the next assault, he reluctantly agreed. Janet Williams volunteered to join the mission, but Sarah convinced her that her medical skills were too valuable to risk. As they prepared for the counterattack, Sarah thought about how far she had traveled from the idealistic young medic who had arrived in Afghanistan wanting to heal the world. She was now planning to launch an offensive military operation, something she never could have imagined herself doing. But she had learned that protecting life sometimes required taking difficult actions. The counterattack launched at 3 in the morning, during the darkest part of the night, when enemy sentries would be least alert. Sarah, Kumar, and Miguel moved silently through the debris-filled hospital compound, using shadows and damaged buildings for concealment. Sarah's heart was pounding, but her hands were steady as she carried the improvised explosive devices they had created from medical supplies. The enemy forces had established their heavy weapons position on a hill overlooking the hospital, exactly where Kumar had predicted. 2 mortar tubes and a heavy machine gun were positioned to provide maximum firepower for the next assault. Sarah could see at least 6 enemy fighters guarding the position, with more probably sleeping in nearby shelters. Kumar signaled for Sarah and Miguel to circle around to the far side of the position while he created a distraction from the front. The plan was simple: use the improvised explosives to destroy the heavy weapons, then retreat back to the hospital before enemy forces could organize a response. Everything depended on speed, surprise, and precise timing. As Sarah moved into position, she thought about Tommy Rodriguez lying helpless in his hospital bed, about Abdul the farmer who trusted her to protect him, about all the patients who were counting on her to keep them safe. These thoughts gave her strength and clarity as she prepared to risk everything on a desperate mission. The attack on the weapons position went almost perfectly. Kumar's distraction drew the sentry's attention while Sarah and Miguel planted their explosives on the mortar tubes. The improvised bombs, created from cleaning chemicals and medical oxygen tanks, destroyed both mortars and damaged the heavy machine gun beyond repair. But as they were retreating, Miguel stepped on a piece of metal debris that made a loud noise. Enemy fighters immediately realized they were under attack and began pursuing the 3-person counterattack team. What had been planned as a quick, silent raid became a running firefight back to the hospital. Miguel was wounded during the retreat, taking a bullet in his leg that left him unable to keep up with Sarah and Kumar. Without hesitation, Sarah turned back to help him, exposing herself to enemy fire as she dragged the wounded medic towards safety. Kumar provided covering fire, but enemy forces were closing in rapidly. Sarah managed to get Miguel to within 50 meters of the hospital building before enemy forces surrounded their position. She found herself in the most desperate firefight of her life, trying to protect a wounded colleague while outnumbered and outgunned. This was the moment that would define everything she had learned about courage, commitment, and the true meaning of medical service. The firefight lasted nearly 10 minutes, with Sarah moving between different positions to avoid enemy fire while keeping Miguel covered. She used every tactical lesson Kumar had taught her, every bit of medical knowledge that could help in combat, and every ounce of determination she possessed. Her grandmother's voice seemed to speak to her, reminding her that protecting life was worth any sacrifice. Just when their situation seemed hopeless, Dr. Morrison and Janet Williams appeared at the hospital entrance with covering fire that allowed Sarah to drag Miguel to safety. The medical staff had risked their own lives to save their colleagues, demonstrating that the bonds forged during the siege were stronger than any military unit. Inside the hospital, Sarah worked frantically to treat Miguel's wounds while Kumar assessed the results of their mission. The counterattack had been successful. Enemy forces no longer had heavy weapons capable of seriously damaging the hospital building. But it had also escalated the conflict and made enemy forces more determined to overrun the facility. Dawn brought the largest assault yet. Enemy forces attacked from multiple directions simultaneously, using every remaining weapon and fighter they had available. Sarah realized this would be the decisive battle. Either they would repel this assault and possibly discourage further attacks, or they would be overwhelmed and everyone in the hospital would be killed or captured. The final assault lasted over 2 hours and tested every defender to their absolute limits. Sarah found herself commanding sections of the defense, while Kumar coordinated overall strategy. Dr. Morrison treated wounded defenders even while fighting himself. Janet Williams proved to be surprisingly effective with a rifle, protecting patients who couldn't be moved to safer positions. During the most intense part of the fighting, enemy forces managed to breach the main entrance of the hospital building. Sarah found herself in face-to-face combat with fighters who had penetrated to within meters of the patient wards. This was the moment she had prepared for throughout the siege, the final test of her commitment to protecting helpless patients. The hand-to-hand combat inside the hospital was brutal and chaotic. Sarah fought with a combination of medical knowledge, military training, and desperate determination. She was no longer thinking about the ethics of violence or the contradiction between healing and fighting. Her only focus was on the patients lying helpless in their beds, depending on her for protection. At the critical moment of the battle, when enemy forces seemed on the verge of reaching the patient wards, Sarah heard a sound that changed everything. The distinctive roar of American helicopter gunships approaching the hospital. A rescue force had finally arrived, drawn by the smoke and sounds of the extended battle. The arrival of helicopter support broke the back of the enemy assault. Fighters who had been confident of victory suddenly found themselves under attack from the air. Those who weren't killed or wounded in the initial helicopter strikes began retreating from the hospital compound, ending the 18-hour siege. Sarah collapsed against a wall as the gunfire finally stopped, emotionally and physically exhausted from the longest fight of her life. She looked around the damaged hospital building and saw patients who were still alive, medical staff who had discovered courage they didn't know they possessed, and the evidence of what people could accomplish when they truly committed to protecting others. The rescue force that arrived at the hospital included Army Rangers, medical evacuation helicopters, and a full medical team. Colonel Martinez, Sarah's commanding officer from the regional command, was among the first through the door. He found Sarah still holding her rifle, covered in dust and smoke, looking like a combat veteran rather than a medic. Colonel Martinez later said that he initially didn't recognize Sarah. The quiet, compassionate medic he had known had been transformed by the siege into someone who radiated confidence and strength. She had become a leader who had successfully commanded the defense of a medical facility against overwhelming odds. The evacuation of patients began immediately, with the most critically injured being airlifted to major medical facilities. Tommy Rodriguez was among the first to be evacuated, and, as he was loaded onto a helicopter, he grabbed Sarah's hand one more time. "You kept your promise, Doc," he said. "You got us home." Abdul, the elderly Afghan farmer, was also evacuated to receive additional medical care. Through a translator, he told Sarah that he had never seen anyone fight so hard to protect people who weren't even from their own country. His words reminded Sarah that her actions had meaning beyond military victory. They represented the best of what medical service could be. The final casualty count from the siege showed the magnitude of what the defenders had accomplished. Despite being outnumbered more than 4-1, despite having no heavy weapons or air support, despite being trapped in an isolated position, they had successfully protected every patient under their care. Not a single wounded soldier or civilian patient had been lost to enemy action. The cost had been high. Miguel Santos required extensive surgery, but would recover fully. 2 of Kumar's soldiers had been seriously wounded, but survived. The hospital building was heavily damaged and would require complete reconstruction. But everyone who had been in the facility when the siege began was still alive. In the weeks following the siege, Sarah's story spread throughout the American military and medical communities. She had shown that medical personnel could maintain their healing mission even under the most extreme combat conditions. More importantly, she had demonstrated that protecting life sometimes required courage and sacrifice beyond what anyone might normally expect. Sarah was offered numerous commendations and awards, including a recommendation for the Silver Star, one of the military's highest honors for valor in combat. But she declined most of the recognition, insisting that everyone at the hospital had been equally heroic. She was more interested in returning to medical work than in being celebrated as a war hero. The siege of the Mountain Hospital also led to changes in how remote medical facilities were protected and how medical personnel were trained for combat situations. Sarah's improvised tactics and leadership techniques were studied and incorporated into training programs for military medical units. But for Sarah personally, the most important outcome of the siege was a deeper understanding of what it meant to be a healer. Her grandmother's lessons about protecting life and creating spaces for healing had been tested in the most extreme way possible. Sarah had learned that sometimes the greatest act of compassion required the willingness to fight. 6 months after the siege, Sarah was back in the United States, working at a veterans hospital and helping other medical professionals understand the psychological challenges of serving in combat zones. She often spoke to medical students about the ethical complexities of military service and the importance of being prepared to protect patients under any circumstances. Tommy Rodriguez recovered fully from his injuries and returned to college to study engineering, just as he had planned. He stayed in touch with Sarah, writing to tell her about his progress and to thank her for saving his life. Miguel Santos also recovered and continued his military medical service, applying the leadership lessons he had learned during the siege. Abdul, the Afghan farmer, returned to his village after his medical treatment was completed. Through aid organizations, he sent messages to Sarah expressing his gratitude and describing how the story of the siege had become known throughout his region. The tale of the American medic who had fought to protect both American soldiers and Afghan civilians had become a symbol of hope. Dr. Morrison, Janet Williams, and the other medical staff from the Mountain Hospital were reassigned to different units, but they maintained contact with each other. The bonds forged during those 18 hours of combat lasted long after the siege ended. They had all learned something about themselves and about the true meaning of medical service. Sergeant Kumar was promoted and given command of his own unit. He often spoke about the siege as an example of how leadership could emerge from unexpected sources during crisis situations. His recommendation for Sarah's Silver Star emphasized not just her combat effectiveness, but her ability to inspire others to exceed their own expectations. For Sarah, the siege represented both an ending and a beginning. It marked the end of her identity as someone who had never hurt another person and the beginning of her understanding that protection and healing were sometimes inseparable. She had learned that her grandmother's stories about World War II nurses weren't just history. They were lessons about what medical service might require. Years later, when Sarah spoke to medical students about her experiences, she would tell them that the siege taught her the most important lesson of her career. Medical service wasn't just about treating injuries and illness. It was about creating and defending spaces where healing could happen, no matter what forces might threaten those spaces. The quiet medic who had wanted to heal the world had discovered that sometimes healing the world meant being willing to fight for it. She had found the true meaning of the oath to do no harm. Sometimes preventing harm required taking action that she never could have imagined when she first put on a medic's uniform. Sarah Chin's story became a reminder that heroes don't always look like what people expect. Sometimes they wear combat boots and carry rifles. Sometimes they wear scrubs and carry stethoscopes. And sometimes, when the situation demands it, they do both, protecting life with the same fierce determination that they used to save it. The counterattack was scheduled for the darkest hour before dawn. Sarah, Kumar, and Miguel would leave the hospital building and attempt to reach enemy weapon positions. If successful, they would destroy the heavy weapons and return before enemy forces could organize a response. If unsuccessful, the remaining defenders would continue the defense without them. Before leaving for the mission, Sarah made rounds through the hospital one more time. She checked on Tommy Rodriguez, adjusting his pain medication and reassuring him that everything would be okay. She sat briefly with Abdul, the Afghan farmer, thinking about the complexities of a situation where she was fighting some Afghans to protect others. Sarah also spoke with each member of the medical staff who would remain behind. She gave Dr. Morrison detailed instructions about patient care priorities if she didn't return. She hugged Janet Williams, thanking her for being such a strong colleague throughout the crisis. She promised Miguel's girlfriend, through him, that she would do everything possible to bring him back safely. As the three-person counterattack team prepared to leave the hospital building, Sarah realized that this was the most important medical mission of her career, not because of the technical procedures involved, but because of what it represented about the commitment to preserve life. Her grandmother's lessons about healing and protection were about to be tested in the most extreme way possible. The quiet medic who had devoted her life to healing was about to lead an assault on enemy positions. But, in her mind, it was still an act of healing, an attempt to protect the vulnerable and preserve life in the face of overwhelming odds. The woman who had never wanted to hurt anyone was preparing to fight with everything she had to save the people who depended on her. That the quiet mountain hospital had become a fortress. The people inside, patients, medical staff, and security personnel, were now completely dependent on each other for survival. The next assault would probably be larger and better organized. They needed to prepare for a longer siege. Dr. Morrison found Sarah as she was helping treat Kumar's wound. The doctor looked at her with a mixture of admiration and concern. "I never imagined we'd be in this situation," he told her. "But I'm glad you're here with us." Sarah looked around the damaged medical building, seeing patients who were terrified but still alive, wounded defenders who were still fighting, and colleagues who had discovered courage they didn't know they had. She thought about her grandmother's stories and realized she finally understood what the older woman had tried to teach her about the true meaning of healing. "We're not finished yet," Sarah told Dr. Morrison. "These people came here for medical care, and we're going to make sure they get it, no matter what it takes." Outside, enemy forces were regrouping and planning their next assault. But inside the hospital, something had changed. The medical staff was no longer just a group of healers waiting to be rescued. They had become protectors, willing to fight for their patients' lives and their own principles. Sarah Chun had discovered that sometimes the greatest act of healing requires the courage to stand between the innocent and those who would harm them. Sarah made her decision that night. She told Kumar that if evacuation became impossible and the patients couldn't be moved, she would help defend the hospital. She couldn't reconcile abandoning helpless patients with her understanding of what it meant to be a medic. If protecting her patients required her to fight, then she would fight. Kumar nodded his understanding and respect. He promised to provide Sarah with additional weapons training and to include her in defensive planning. But he also made clear that he hoped it wouldn't come to that. Everyone's preference was successful evacuation with all patients safely removed. As Sarah returned to the medical building to check on overnight patients, she had no idea that enemy forces were already moving closer to the hospital. Scouts had been observing the facility for days, counting personnel and noting security weaknesses. The attack plan was already in motion. Sarah's decision to help defend the hospital if necessary would soon be tested in ways she could never have imagined. The quiet medic who had devoted her life to healing was about to discover what she was capable of when everything she cared about was threatened. As threats in the region continued to increase, Colonel Martinez visited the mountain hospital to assess the situation. He met privately with Dr. Morrison and Sergeant Kumar to discuss security protocols. Sarah wasn't included in these meetings, but she could sense the tension among the leadership team. After the colonel's visit, security procedures at the hospital became more strict. Patrols around the facility increased. Additional defensive positions were established. The medical staff was briefed on evacuation procedures in case the hospital came under attack. Everyone was told to be ready to leave on short notice if the situation deteriorated. Sarah understood the need for these precautions, but she also worried about their patients. Many of the wounded soldiers were in no condition to be moved quickly. The local civilians they treated would have nowhere else to go for medical care if the hospital was evacuated. She hoped the security situation would improve so they could continue their mission. Unknown to Sarah and the rest of the hospital staff, enemy intelligence had identified the mountain facility as a strategic target. The hospital's location made it a crucial supply and medical hub for American forces operating in the region. More importantly, its destruction would send a powerful message that nowhere was safe from attack. As Sarah went about her daily routine of caring for patients and training local medical helpers, she had no idea that enemy forces were already moving into position in the surrounding mountains. The quiet mountain hospital where she had found her calling as a healer was about to become the center of a battle that would test everyone's courage and commitment. Sarah's grandmother had always told her that a person's true character was revealed not in easy times, but in the moments when everything seemed impossible. Sarah was about to discover what her grandmother meant, and she was about to learn that sometimes the greatest act of healing requires the courage to fight.